Well, good evening and welcome to the Tarot 101 class for fall of 2020. Thank you all for giving me your time and attention and attending this class. I'm very excited to have so many wonderful students in this class. So before we get started, there's a few logistical things I want to discuss with you. First of all, the class is going to be starting at 7 o'clock and run till approximately 9:30. So I'm going to ask everybody to try to get here at least 5 minutes before the class starts so you won't miss any material. But if for any reason you do miss a little bit of material or you want to review, I will be recording each of the classes and I will make them available to you. I'm not exactly sure what that looks like just yet, but once I work it out, I'll send you an email with instructions for how you can monitor the lesson after it's presented. During the course of the class, I'm sure that you will have some questions. Now, the first part of the class, I'll be providing you with a lecture, and during that lecture, if any questions come up, the way you want to deal with that is to send me the question in the private chat box that you'll see at the bottom of the screen where it says chat. Click on that and then look over where it says who you're sending it to and just send it to me personally. Or you can send it to the whole group if you want, and I will, after the lecture, try to answer all the questions. Additionally, I'm going to have some homework questions that I'm going to be sending out to you folks after the lecture, and I would strongly encourage you to actually do the lessons. I've had a lot of people take my classes and tell me that they really enjoy them. But then afterwards, maybe 6 months later, I run into them and I ask them if they're doing anything with it. And a lot of times the answer is no, not really. And I think it's because they're not really putting the material to work. So my workshop homework assignment for you is designed to get you directly involved in working with the tarot material. So please try to get that done. So before we begin, I thought I'd tell you a little story. And it's my story about how I got involved in the tarot. People often ask me if I always thought that I was psychic or that I started at a very early age. And the truth of the matter is, the first time anybody ever said to me that I was psychic, I had no idea even what they were saying. So no, I didn't start out knowing as much as I know today or feeling that I had any psychic ability. So how did I get interested in the tarot? Well, it started while I was in the military. I went to one of those crazy parties that military people often have where there's music and food and incense and some other things that maybe I shouldn't mention. Actually, it's legal in Colorado. We were smoking pot back then, so that was part of our routine. At any rate, I was hanging out at this party, and this friend of mine came over and he said, "Look, I want to show you something." And he pulled out a tarot deck. And I had never seen these cards before, and I was like, whoa, this is really interesting. And I knew that there was something really important about those cards for me. I just didn't know what it was. So he tried to do a reading for me, and it didn't really go very well. But I'll tell you that it sure got my interest. Because a few years later, after I got out of the military, I went into a record shop back in the day when they sold music on vinyl, and you'd go to a little corner store to buy the records. And, you know, they had everything in those stores. They had Dayglow posters, they had incense, and they had tarot cards. And I saw a tarot card deck in a display case, and so I decided that I was going to buy them. So I did. And I took them home, and I looked at the instruction booklet that came with the cards and couldn't quite make sense of it. So I went out and found a little how-to book at the King Soopers of all places. And I started looking at that book, and I couldn't make sense of that either. So, for 10 years, my tarot deck sat on my bookshelf waiting for me to get interested in it again. And it was after I moved to Colorado that I actually met somebody who read tarot professionally. And I told her, I said, I'd always been really interested in the tarot, and I wanted to learn. So she said, all right. So she put together a class. And that's when things started to really click for me, because I took that class, much like you are taking this class, with several other people that wanted to learn, and we did a lot of sharing with each other, and we got each other's perspective. And that's when I really started to feel a sense of the tarot was going to be an important part of my life. So a question you're probably asking yourself at this point is, why does the Tarot work? And I think that is an extremely important question for you to be asking. Where does the guidance come from? Why do the cards seem to be relevant to people's lives? Or, let me say this to you. In reading thousands of times, I will tell you I've had experiences where the cards are eerie, how relevant they seem to be to a person's life. And I've had other situations where the cards say, we're not talking, because the person wasn't really open. And it's hard to predict which one's going to happen anytime you go to do a reading. Now, you may think after 1,000 readings that every time I sit down to do a reading, that I have 100% confidence. But I got to tell you, that's not the way it is. Every time I sit down, I ask myself the question, is this going to work today? I hope it's going to work, and I have faith it's going to work. But what is it that I have faith in? I have faith that there is a guiding intelligence in the universe. You can call it whatever you want. Call it the Force, call it Allah, call it Buddha, call it God if you want. It doesn't really matter what you call it. But I do believe there's a guiding intelligence, and I do believe that intelligence wants to support us in our self-realization. And the Tarot, more than anything, is a tool of self-realization. So when I go to do a reading, I don't look at the cards and say, oh, this card means this and this card means that. That, I think, is part of why a lot of people can't get past the initial stage, because they try or they think they have to memorize what each card means. That's not the best approach. I think a good approach is to learn some basic general ideas that are common to most of the cards. For instance, all of the pentacle cards have pentacles on them, and therefore they're all of a similar story. All the sword cards have swords on them, etc., etc. So learn the general themes, and then learn some of the specific symbology that's present in the cards, but be willing each time you look at the cards to let the cards actually talk to you. Be willing to be surprised, because I got to tell you, I get surprised all the time. So I want to say it's really essential, if you're going to work with the Tarot, that you have the right attitude. Now, to me, what the right attitude means is you have to trust that the cards are relevant. You got to be willing to trust that the information you get is worth exploring. You got to have a sense of respect for the cards and respect for the messages that you get, so that they will keep talking to you. I find that working with the cards, or working with dreams, or working with any other psychic or intuitive ability is something that you can develop. It's something that you cultivate, and by working with it through an attitude of trust, you'll find that your ability will increase. But the key thing is you must let yourself work with the cards. So again, it's important that you have respect for the cards, respect for the guidance behind the cards. You want to trust that guidance. And thirdly, you want to have confidence. Now, I'm not talking about confidence from an ego point of view. I'm talking about confidence in spirit and confidence in the guidance that spirit is sending to you. And be willing to be wrong sometimes. I got to tell you, I've done readings where I thought I knew what the reading was about, and I talked to the person, and the person said, nope, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. Sometimes what I do is I readjust the way I'm looking at the cards. Other times I say, I must not be the right reader for you, and I shake hands with the person, give them back their money if they have paid me, and send them on their way. And you got to be willing to do that. You got to be willing to let it go. But before you let it go, you got to be willing to be really present and take a chance. Take a chance on telling them what it is that you actually see in the cards. So I guess what I'm saying to you is you learn to get your ego out of the way. Sometimes your ego is going to get bruised. Other times your ego might get inflated. Either one doesn't serve you. Allow yourself to be a vessel for Spirit's message. That's the best thing you can do when you're reading. So people often ask me, oh, how does this work? Have you always had psychic ability? And I got to tell you, when I was young, I don't think I had much psychic ability. But it is something that can be cultivated, as I said earlier. So you want to be willing to do that. You want to be willing to cultivate your psychic ability, and you want to trust that you have psychic ability? Because I want to tell you, I think everybody has the potential, if not a really strong capacity. So it's something you can develop. So if initially it doesn't seem to be working, don't get discouraged. Just keep working. So one question you might ask yourself is, why does it work? Is it, are we given psychic information to scare people? Would that be a valuable thing? I don't think so. I believe that the cards, or the guidance we receive through the cards, is guidance from Spirit to empower people. So I don't believe in prediction. I don't do prediction. What I do is what I call a weather report. I tell people how things are looking, in what direction they're heading, and I tell them, most importantly, they have free will in terms of how they respond to what's coming their way or what has happened. And as long as you know you have free will, you can make a difference. And that's the point of a psychic reading, is to empower people by informing them about what the dynamics are that are operating in a tarot card reading. You know, the point is, you don't want to scare people. You want to empower people to make effective choices in their lives. And the tarot is a really excellent way of empowering people, because it brings to the surface things that people need to know. Very often when I do a reading, what people tell me is, yeah, I was sort of thinking about that anyway. I was sort of in the back of my mind, and you helped me to bring it to the forefront. And that is a really valuable thing. So what do the cards represent? Well, one way to say it would be that the cards are archetypes. Now, what's an archetype? An archetype is something that you find in almost all cultures. Like every culture, every person has some sort of dynamic with the archetype of father. So that's a simple example of that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to my PowerPoint presentation so I can give you some visuals to go along with what I'm talking about. So the tarot is made up of 5 suits. 4 of the suits are what we call the minor arcana. And these cards actually are like little vignettes or little pictures of events or stories that go on in people's lives. The 4 minor arcana suits are the pentacles, which look like, well, pentacles, then wands, then cups, and then swords. And the 5th suit is what we call the major arcana. Now, the 4 minor arcana suits actually correspond with playing cards. The minor arcana, as I said, is pentacles, which look like that. And then you have, and they correspond with diamonds in regular playing cards. Then you have wands, which look like that. And they correspond with clubs in playing cards. Thirdly, you have cups, which look like that. And that corresponds with hearts in playing cards. And then you have swords. What's going on here? It's not working. Oh, there it is. Okay. And that corresponds with spades. Okay. So now each of these 4 suits, pentacle and minor arcana, they actually correspond with an element. Pentacles corresponds with the element of earth. So when you look at pentacle cards, they often deal with things that have to do with form, like money or materiality, or physical form, things in physical form. Money, I like to say money, magic, and manifestation. Now, the magic piece has to do with the fact that with pentacles, how things manifest in the world actually is somewhat magical when you really look at it and you really think about it. I'm sure as we go along, you'll understand what I mean a little bit better. Now, the wands corresponds to the suit of fire. Now, when you think about fire, which of course we're all thinking a lot about that right now because there's a lot of forest fires going on, but one of the things that we know about fire is that it transforms things. When a fire comes through an area, after it's gone through the area, everything looks completely different. Or when a fire consumes a log in a fireplace, for instance, it doesn't look anything like what it started as. So fire is very transformational. Now for us, fire corresponds on a personal level with our passion, our fire, what fires us up, what gets us moving. What is it that we desire? And often that takes the form of our work, if we're working at a job that we are passionate about, that's actually works better than if we're just working for money. And we're a lot happier when we're working at something that we have a desire to do. Like if you're a nurse, it's because maybe you have a desire to be helpful to other people. Now with cups, the element that it corresponds to is water. And the key thing about water is to think about how water needs to flow. And on a personal level, water or cups corresponds to our emotions, our feelings. And with our emotions or our feelings, it's important for us to let the feelings flow. We get in trouble sometimes, maybe because we express our emotions inappropriately, but that's usually when we direct our emotions outside of ourselves, at someone. But if instead we allowed ourselves to feel what we feel and think about what the emotion is showing us or teaching us about our lives, that will help us to really understand. One of the things I say about emotions is that all feeling, all emotion is guidance from spirit. You can't make yourself feel emotion on a particular day. You can say, well, today I'm going to love. I mean, you can go out and you can look for something that may evoke a love within you, but you can't just turn it on by your pure willpower. Emotion is guidance from spirit, is the way I look at it. And all of our feelings, even the ones that we think of as negative, fear, anger, they actually have a message. And the challenge is figuring out what the message is. And part of what the Tarot will help us to do is clarify what our emotions are trying to teach us. The other thing that cups often relate to is intuition. Sometimes we get a feeling about something. It's not exactly a thought, it's more like an intuitive feeling. And then swords finally corresponds with the element of air. And for us personally, this relates to our intellectual thoughts or our ideas about things. But it can also mean our own personal bias or prejudice, because that is something that exists in our minds, in our intellectual database, if you will. The last suit, as I said to you, is the Major Arcana. Now, this one is the one that we study the most because it's so different. So what is the Major Arcana? Well, one way to look at it is to say that the Major Arcana is a story. It corresponds with what is called the hero's journey. Now, if any of you studied Joseph Campbell wrote a book called The Hero of a Thousand Faces. And in this book, he talked about the fact that the journey of the hero is pretty much a universal story that everybody goes through in one way or another. If you look back and think about your life, there's different times in which you set out on a quest. And that through the process of going on a journey, your life was completely transformed. Now, the other way that the Major Arcana is described, it's described as a series of what are called archetypes. Now, that's a big word. And so, of course, you're probably going to ask the question, what is an archetype? That's something I've studied for over 40 years. I'm still working on figuring it out. But what I thought I'd do is start tonight by giving you what the dictionary definition is. An archetype is a statement that describes a pattern of behavior, or a prototype. It's a first form or a main model that other statements, patterns of behavior, and objects copy, emulate, or merge. Oh, that's a lot of gobbledygook there, isn't it? Let me just say it this way. I think an archetype is something that's first, it's sort of back and behind different forms. So like, for instance, one archetype is the king, or in the Tarot, it's called the emperor. But if you look at different languages, you can find that there's all sorts of different words for this archetype. There's ruler, there's president, there's potentate, there's king, there's queen. That actually corresponds with the archetype of ruler. There are many, many different words that all relate to that same archetype. So often from culture to culture, what you find is that there are different definitions or different words that describe this underlying archetype that runs through all society or all civilizations. And when you understand this, when you understand an archetype is something that
that runs throughout all civilization, then you can really get to the idea of how important an archetype is. And that's the great thing about the Tarot, is it's teaching you to work with the archetypes that the major arcana is composed of. Each one of them is an archetype. And then as you learn them and become familiar with them, you'll actually begin to understand the pattern that relates to all society, all civilization, and all personal experiences. Now, the first archetype we're going to talk about, literally the very first card in the major arcana, is the Fool card, which you see before you. Now, interestingly enough, when you look at this card, one of the things that you have to notice, and if you're, by the way, familiar with Rider-Waite, oops, that's not the Rider-Waite version. I'll show you to you in the next slide. What I was going to say is when you look at the Fool card, you got to notice the fact that it's card number 0. Why did they call it 0 and not 1? That's a very important thing we're going to talk about here in just a second. Now, the reason I put the World card here is that if you look at the major arcana as a hero's journey, then the Fool's journey, the Fool is the character on the journey. He's essentially, his journey goes from the first card all the way to the last card in the major arcana, which is the World card. So reaching to the World card is actually the realization of the Fool's dream. Now, one way you can look at this also is to recognize that the Fool is nothing. He's just potential, and that's why he's numbered 0. And that the Magician is actually the very first card, and it is why it's called card number 1. And in one way to describe this would be that the Fool is seeking to discover something about himself. He's seeking to actualize himself. He or she, as you go on a journey through life, you're seeking to become something or discover something or to self-actualize. And the Magician is the embodiment of that self-actualization. He is card number 1. Now, as I said, one of the things I'm going to do in my class is I'm going to teach you a little bit about numerology. Now, with numerology, the belief is that just like with astrology or tarot, numerology is a belief that there are certain energies associated with specific numbers. And then as you learn what those meanings are that are corresponding with numbers, it's very interesting to look at the tarot and to see how these cards actually do correspond with numbers. So here, the Fool is numbered 0, and the number 0 is not actually a number, it's the potential of a number, or it's the card that represents a void. There's something missing, or there's an emptiness, or there's nothing. A 0 is a nothing. And within the Fool, you could say that he is void, or he is empty, or he is nothing. And he's seeking to find himself, to find his one, if you will. Now, here's the Rider-Waite version. And you can see that it's very similar. The card on the left is actually from my deck, which is called the Evolutionary Tarot. And the card on the right is a Rider-Waite. Now, for 35, 40 years, my deck of choice was always the Rider-Waite. And the reason I like that deck so much is because the symbology on the card is very good. So that if you learn to get familiar with the symbols, like the dog is a symbol on the card, or the pole that he's holding on to with the sack behind it is an important symbol. The way he's dressed is an important symbol. As you learn what the symbology is, when you go to look at a card, you don't necessarily have to remember all the specifics of it, but the visual image of the card will trigger, oh yeah, that's right, there's something about his outfit. Well, what do I notice about his outfit? He's wearing loud, contradictory colors, sort of like the old hippie outfits back in the day. If you look at the Rider-Waite guy, he's got a very flamboyant outfit on as well. Well, that in itself is sort of symbolic, because in a way, I think what it symbolizes is that the person on the journey, when you're reading for somebody or you're reading for yourself, the Fool represents that the externalization of all the conflict and contradiction of consciousness within the individual. The person is not really self-aware. They have a sense of a dream, which is why on both cards you'll notice that they're looking up towards the heavens. Now, I chose to do in my deck a nighttime sky because I think it actually shows more potential. It's more than just the sky. It is literally the universe itself. It's the infinity of the universe, and that is what is drawing all of us. Anybody who sets out on the Fool's journey, that's what draws us out. The universe itself is calling to us to discover. And in the process of discovering what is true in the universe, we discover what our place is in the universe. Now, I think an interesting question is, why is a card called the Fool? Does the Fool call himself a fool? No, I don't think so. What I think the card is called the Fool is because other people who look at the Fool and see that he's about to step forth on this journey, and in a sense, he's going to step forth off the ground, and I'll talk about that in a second. But they look at him and they say, where is that fool going? So it's the people that do not have the courage to step forward in life, to take the step on the journey, the hero's journey or the evolutionary journey, however you want to say it. They're the ones that call him the Fool. He doesn't call himself a fool. Now, I was talking about the ground. He's standing on a cliff there, and it looks as if he's about to step off the cliff. And we could say, well, that sounds like disaster. But remember that the tarot is all symbology. Everything that's put on a card is put there for a reason. There's a symbolic message in the way the card is drawn. And in some places, it's going to look as if it contradicts reality, but it really doesn't. So what is the message here? The message is that the Fool is about to step off the known ground of the familiar. He's stepping off the ground into the unknown. And as you step forward, one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to learn to fly, or you're going to fall into the hands of spirit, and you're going to be okay. And we know that he's going to be okay because this is the very beginning of that hero's journey we talked about. And the fact that the journey goes on through the rest of the cards. In fact, one way to say this is the Fool journeys through the entire major arcana. He goes from one card to the next, and each card that he encounters is a significant lesson on his personal development. And you'll see what I mean as we go forward. So what about the dog? I think in this case, the dog represents instinct. It's the instinct that knows something exciting is about to happen. That's why it's pure. It's white. It doesn't have any bias one way or the other. It's excited because now something is really going to happen. Now, remember I talked about his outfit and his multicolored outfit and what that has significance. The significance of that, if you're familiar with the Bible, it goes back to the story of Joseph in his multicolored coat or his technicolor coat. And what does that coat represent? It represents unconscious, contradictory states of consciousness or awareness. At the beginning of any journey that any of us take, we are all naive. We are all ignorant. We are all full of conflict and contradiction. And through the journey of life, through our own personal heroic journey, we become more conscious of what works and what does not work in life. So you can see that this is a really important thing for you to be aware of when you're reading for somebody, because this card comes up. You know, you can talk to them about the fact that this is a very early stage of something. Things are just beginning. It's exciting, but there's a lot to be discovered. Okay, let me talk about one other thing, and that is the wand. Now, I hope that all of you are willing to stay in my class, because it's not a PG class. It's more like an R class. In other words, I will talk about sex in this class. and not necessarily in a provocative way, but in a very important, thinking of sex as not just literal sexuality, but thinking of sex as creative expression. So in the Tarot, there are many places in which you see some sort of sexual symbology, but it's not necessarily literal. Again, it's a symbolic thing. So what does the wand with the little sack on the back look a lot like? Anybody? No, I'm not going to put you guys on the spot. It reminds us of the male phallus, and the little bag on the back part of the wand looks a little bit like the scrotum. Again, it's a metaphor. What's the metaphor? He's grabbed hold of his masculine, assertive, sexual energy. He's got to work with his creativity if he's going to actually interface with the world. We are all creative all the time, not just in our procreation capacity, but in our capacity to interact with the world in an assertive way, in a masculine assertive way, in a feminine receptive way. And I want to give you a caveat before I go any further. You're going to hear me say throughout this class masculine assertiveness and feminine receptivity, but please do not think I'm talking about gender, because I'm not. All of us, from my point of view, all of us have both masculine assertive energy and feminine receptivity. Now, to give you a simple example of that, right now I'm sitting here and I'm talking to you, and in a sense, I'm being very assertive. I'm asserting my ideas into your consciousness, and you all are sitting there being receptive to what I'm saying. Well, so in a sense, you're being feminine receptive. Well, some of you are literally biologically female, and some of you are literally biological male, but you're still both all equally being receptive to this message. Now, it goes even a little bit further. The only way that I could actually be assertive and teach you this material is through my capacity to actually be receptive to the fact that there are 10 people out there in cyberspace who've tuned into this Zoom meeting to learn about the Tarot tonight. So always there is this dance between assertiveness and receptivity within all of us. It's got nothing at all to do with our gender. Okay. Next. All right, so now we're going to move on to the Magician. Now, remember I said that the Magician was, in the sense, the first card. I mean, it literally is the first card. And think about it this way. This is the first thing that the Fool encounters on the Fool's journey. The very first card that he encounters is the Magician. So from 0, we go to 1. So the Magician, in a way, is symbolic of the realization of the Fool's dream. One way to say this would be, the Fool goes on this journey through the major arcana, and through that process, self-actualize and attains the world. And at the point that he has obtained the world, then he becomes a magician. And that's the way the story works. I actually did a little. I wrote a story once about the Tarot as if it was like in a fantasy story, like a medieval kind of adventure. And in the story, there was a character that we called the Fool. And what he did was he literally went out on this journey around this land, and he kept having all these experiences. And at the very end of the story, he actually became the magician. And that is literally what the Tarot is about. It's about becoming magical. It's about finding your own magic. It's about becoming your own magician. But I want to say this to you, and it's really important you understand this. The magician is not a trickster. It's not about he's bending the laws of the universe to his own personal will. The magician is able to manifest whatever it is he wants to manifest, and this is what the card represents for people, is when this comes up, and it does represent that the person is some capacity or is in the midst of manifesting something, and that is represented in front of him on the table. You see there's a cup, a sword, a wand, and a pentacle, meaning that the magician is able to manifest in any of the suits of the minor arcana. He's able to bring something into expression. Now, how does he do that? He does that because he is able to tap into universal law in principle. That's why he's got this one hand up with a wand in it. Actually, a better word than a wand would be to say that what he's got in his hand is a lightning rod. So what is he doing? What does a lightning rod do? It draws down power from the heavens down to the material world. So the magician taps into universal law and principle, or the power that's in the heavens, and he brings things into manifestation. But he does it according to law and principle, not according to egotistical will. He aligns himself. So if you look at his other hand is pointed down towards the earth. So you can sort of imagine the energy of the heavens flowing through the magician down into form. So is he truly a magician in the sense that he's bending the laws of the universe? No, he just has, or he represents a person, man or woman, who has a higher understanding of law and principle, and that through their understanding are able to make something happen. You know, if you wanted to bake a cake and you knew you had a recipe and you had in front of you eggs and flour and sugar and milk and whatever else goes into cake, and you combine them in a particular way in the right proportion, and you put them into the oven, voila, cake will come out of the oven. But when you look at the stuff before you make the cake, it doesn't look anything like what the cake looks like once it's finished. So to someone on the outside who doesn't know about baking a cake, it might appear to be magical. That's the idea of the magician, is people don't necessarily understand the same thing that the magician understands. Now, there's some really important symbols on the magician card. We've talked about the suits on the table, but notice that he has a belt, both in the Rider-Waite and in my deck. You'll see there's a snake who has the tail in its mouth. Now that is called an Uberos. Now, why does he have a belt that has a snake with a tail in its mouth? Well, you have to remember what snakes represent. In most cultures, and the archetype of the snake, even though a lot of people are afraid of them, the archetype of the snake represents life force. Some people call it Kundalini, but that it's bigger than just sexual energy, because a lot of people think Kundalini is just sexual energy, but it's not. It's literally life force energy. So why does the snake have its tail in its mouth? It represents that within the magician, there's a unity. The number one, also, look at what some of those words are that relate to the number one. There is this idea of self-determination. There's this idea of creativity. The snake with its tail in its mouth is an expression of self-determination. One way to say it would be that the magician has unified within himself the masculine and the feminine energy. And that is what allows him to do creativity of any sort, whether it's creative thought or creative expression. So the snake represents the unity of the masculine and feminine within the magician. You also see that on my card with the yin-yang symbol that holds his robe on. Now, there's another important symbol in this card, and that is above his head, you'll see this thing which is called a Lumisgate. And the Lumisgate, it looks a little bit like a sideways figure 8, but there's something really tricky about this thing, and that is that the Lumisgate actually turns. There's a turn in the Lumisgate. It turns on itself. So next week, I will actually have a prop to show you what that looks like. But the idea is that when you have that little twist or the little turn in the Lumisgate, it ends up having only one side. The Lumisgate represents that the oneness of the two polarities. You can look at the 2 points or the 2 extremes of the Lumisgate, representing, again, unity of masculine and feminine, or the other unity that's expressed in this card is the unity between the heavens, the realm of the ideas, and the earth, the realm of the 4 suits that are on the table. So the magician is about unifying or bridging the heavens and the earth. You know, a recipe like baking a cake exists in the heavens or it exists in the abstract. So a magician taps into that recipe, goes through the conjuring of putting all this stuff together in order to make the cake, and he brings that into manifestation. So in all sorts of different ways, the card represents oneness, a oneness between heavens and earth, a oneness between the masculine and the feminine, and that when we know and we align ourselves properly, and it's not a matter of will, it's a matter of alignment. When you align yourself appropriately, you are able to come up with original thought. You are able to come up with creative expression. But you have to have that will of aligning yourself appropriately, and you have to have that determination to stick with it. And the magician is exploratory in the sense that he's exploring what an expression would look like. It's the beginning of expression. It's the first expression. And the magician very much is about self-determination. So the magician follows the fool, and in a sense, he is confirmation for the fool that how the fool looks at the world is correct, that there is something to be realized, that there's a possibility. So in a way, the magician is confirmation of the fool's dream. But is the fool ready to do what the magician does? No, absolutely not. He has to deal with some other things, which brings us, well, like we were just talking about this, which brings us to the next card, which is the High Priestess. Now, if the magician is card number 1, which represents unity, then the next card, the High Priestess, is card number 2, and she represents polarity or duality. She represents separation. If you look at the pillars, with the B and the J on the background, one pillar is supposed to be black and one's white. And the idea is the beginning and the ending, also the male and the female, the heavens and the earth. The whole idea here is where the magician is unity, the High Priestess represents separation. Now, why is she so strongly associated with the moon? Because if the magician represents knowledge, then the High Priestess represents intuition. Now, intuition is not the same thing as knowledge. It is knowing that there is wisdom out there, but it's not consciously knowing it like the magician knows it. It's intuitively knowing it. And in a sense, the High Priestess represents becoming aware of the separation between an idea and manifestation, what is so and what is not so. You notice that on her chest, she has a cross. Now, that's a very important symbol. The cross is a very important symbol, and you need to look at the cross in a larger context than just Christianity. The cross is a universal symbol that appears in many, many different traditions, many different spiritual traditions, and it appears there because it's an important symbol. Here, instead of the circle of wholeness that we saw with the magician, with the cross, what we're seeing is things are separate. Here, the heavens and the earth are separate. Here, the male and the female are separate. That's the idea of two. There's two things. And the moon represents the intuition that knows that there is something there to be realized. Now, if you look behind her, you see that there's a curtain. And if you look carefully behind that curtain, you look and you can see something blue. Well, that represents the blue waters of emotion. So oftentimes when we're struggling, or when someone is struggling to work with the tarot, they are going to get information through their emotions or through their intuition. That's how the information comes to them. So the moon represents what? It's indirect sunlight. The sun's lights reflects off the moon back onto the earth. So we're seeing things indirectly. When we don't have the knowledge or the awareness of the magician, we sense that there's something there, but we're not seeing it directly. We're sensing it indirectly. So here with the High Priestess, we're very much starting to get a sense of the difference between knowing and not knowing, and also harmony. The magician represents unity or oneness, whereas the high priestess, I wouldn't exactly say that she represents disharmony, but she definitely represents a sense of there's opposition, and that there's also a sense of separation, and sometimes there's discord. So with a high priestess, you want to look around and see and talk to the person that you're working with to see if there's any sense of some sort of discord or some sort of conflict. Now you notice that the magician was masculine and the high priestess is feminine. The idea with this card is it's very much important to be receptive to what's going on. One of the key things that's interesting about the high priestess, when you look at it from a neurological point of view, is the idea of diplomacy. Now, diplomacy doesn't necessarily mean resolution or reconciliation. What diplomacy means is being able to sit between two opposing camps, just like she sits between the two opposing pillars, or the separation between the masculine and the feminine, or the heavens and the earth. And the idea of diplomacy is being able to sit in that uncomfortable position where you see what's going on, where maybe the person is struggling with balance. Maybe they're struggling with oppositional energy, or they're struggling with conflict or discord. So you want to look for, with this card, you definitely want to look for what's going on in the person's life that might be causing them some difficulty. And you want to help them by helping them to clue them into the idea of listening to their intuition, because our intuition will often have a sense of the way out of conflict, the way out of discord, but it takes some arbitration, it takes some work, it takes forming some partnership and working through the difficulties. So one way to say this is that the magician represents the masculine, assertive knowledge, whereas the high priestess is the feminine, receptive, and it's the intuitive rather than the knowledge base. And so these two are sort of like a pair, but think of them not as a pair in the sense of like a marriage or a coupling. Think of it rather as polarized masculine and polarized feminine. So sometimes when you see these in readings, that could be an indication that the two people that maybe are in a relationship or they're having some struggle at work has to do with the fact that there's very much they're not in sync with each other. They're very different in their nature. The next card we come to is card number 3, which is called the Empress. Now, this is the Rider-Waite version of it. And the numerological keywords, well, the first one I think is most important, and that is creativity. If you look at the my deck, you can very much tell that she's pregnant. The implication in the Rider-Waite deck also is that she's pregnant, although it's not as visible on my deck. In some decks, they leave it off altogether. Some decks, they really examine it. So what does that say to us? Well, where there was previously conflict between the magician and the high priestess, now what we have is a unity of the masculine and feminine have come together in a creative act, which is literally represented, or excuse me, symbolically represented in the literal idea of pregnancy. Now, also when you look around this card, what you see, before I go on to that, notice the fact that she's got something in her hand. It looks like a little wand, right? If you look at the Rider-Waite, you can see the symbol on the little shield there in front of her. It's a circle on top of a cross. That's the symbol that we associate with the feminine, or Venus, or Mars is the circle with the spear. Here it's the circle and the cross. Now that's a very interesting symbol that I don't think a lot of people think about or deal with. If you go back to the high priestess, and you remember that she had a cross on her chest, what that cross represented was the energies at cross purposes. The male and the female not working together, the heavens and the earth not working together. But here what has happened symbolically is the cross of conflict has been transcended by the circle of wholeness. The circle reminds us of the dot in the magician. It reminds us of that sense of wholeness. So with the first card, you had wholeness, then you had a sense of separation. Now you're coming back to wholeness again. Now you're coming back to things coming together. And what the Empress is telling us is that it is possible to transcend all conflict through the process of creatively unifying the masculine and the feminine. And that is literally what she represents, the union of the masculine and feminine that brings forth new life, brings forth childhood energy, if you will. And some other key words that are associated with the Empress is art. Well, art is creative expression. Love is associated with the Empress. And I think love in the sense of that she represents love drawing together the two, the masculine and the feminine, into a unity of creativity. And that when we are able to bring those two together, we are able to bring forth self-expression. So you notice that there's a very interesting thing of, like, in a way, the Empress resonates the magician energy. So you see this sort of this back and forth thing going on between there's unity and then there's separation. Now there's unity again. And this card, the card number 3, the Empress, also relates to imagination. When we are inspired by love, when we are filled with emotion, we are inspired to imagine new life. And when we have a sense of wholeness between the male and the female, or the heavens and the earth, that's when communication happens. My belief is that the tarot works because I trust that there's spiritual energy, and I believe that spiritual energy communicates with me. If I didn't trust it, if I felt that there was some malevolent force in the universe trying to trick me, then how could I trust my intuition? How could I trust the guidance that I get? But if I trust that there is goodness in the universe and that spiritual energy is good and it wants to support me, well, then I start getting messages. I know some of you have had readings with me, and I think probably you're in this class in part because you like my reading. Well, this is part of my approach to the reading, is I'm trusting Spirit. I'm trusting that Spirit is going to work with me and therefore work with you. Now, the next card after the Empress is the Emperor. Now, this is a very interesting character. There's some significant differences between the Emperor and the Empress, in the sense that water has become a much less of a influence in the card. There's a little stream that's running behind him. In fact, you might say symbolically then that the water in the background represents that emotion has receded. And now what has come to the forefront is the intellect, because the Emperor represents masculine intellect, conceptual. Now, why does he follow the Empress? The Empress is the creativity that is inherent in nature, and we learn about creativity from nature, and then what we do is we come to step number 4, where mankind starts to try to create civilization. He creates a structure of law and principle and government in order to rule. And the card isn't just about governments in the larger sense, but it's also self-governance. That once you start having a sense of your creativity that is present in the Empress card, then it's like, all right, so how I have to practice self-discipline in terms of how do I apply that? I know that there's some artists in the room, and how does one become an artist? Well, you may start out with an intuition that says, oh yeah, it'd be fun to paint or to draw or something. But then you have to go through learning your tools, learning about how to work with your different mediums, whether it's acrylics or oils or watercolors or charcoal or pencil or multimedia, whatever it is that you do, you have to learn how to work with your medium. So it's like after you are inspired by that creative energy that you see in the Empress, well, then you have to start practicing self-discipline. And discipline means focus. The Emperor is all about focus. It's about masculine, assertive focus of energy. Now, you notice he's got a thing in his right hand. It's called an Ankh. And it's a very old Egyptian symbol. And what the Ankh represents is literally the power of life over death, or the power of life and death. And that symbol represents that the Emperor is the ruler of civilization, or even the ruler of our home. One archetype, one word for the archetype is father. The Emperor is the Tarot version of father. He's the father of civilization. He's the father of self-government. And he's very intellectual. It's not, that's why he wears the little squares. Now, the square is a very interesting symbol, because a square is not something you find present in nature very much. You find squares mostly in what we do as mankind. Like if you're sitting in a room, you can look around and you can see walls are square, the ceiling is square. The way we build things is all based around the idea of the square. So a square is a powerful symbol for how man creates. But remember that man is always working with a limited deck, if you will. He doesn't know everything. He starts out with some knowledge from his interaction with let me give you those numerological keywords. He has some interaction with the Empress, and out of that, he becomes the builder. The Emperor also relates to things like boundaries and creating stability. Now, Emperor can represent a problem of sometimes people are too fixed in their thinking. They're too much operating out of limits, and they're not open-minded. They become rigid or too conservative. And there is some value in conservation. If you have too much change, you end up with chaos. But you have to have a balance between change and stability. And he represents that stability, that comes out when man first starts to create. He is an executive in the sense that an executive is the ruler of a company. So the Emperor can symbolize literally a person in a position of authority. So if you're doing a reading for somebody and the Emperor card came up, let's say in a position that indicated it was a problem for the person, then you might very well be telling you that the person is having trouble with his boss at work. So you can look for that kind of information. The Emperor is practical in the sense of, at a certain point, you have to take your emotional flights of fancy and bring them down into something that you can actually build on. If you want to build something, you have to have a strong foundation. To have a good foundation, you have to have correct knowledge or information. The Emperor very much relates to the idea of form. He represents mankind putting things into form. And his ideas are foundational in the sense of he helps to create society or civilization. Now, these two are a couple, the Emperor and the Empress. So they represent sort of the dual power within ourselves. There's a power within ourselves that is like the Emperor, that relates to civilization and society. But there's also within us this other power, the power of creativity. And you have to work with those energies. You have to work those energies to bring them into balance with each other, sort of like the magician and the high priestess. Here it's a balance between the emperor and the empress. Okay, or another way to say this is mother and father. This is very interesting when you're doing readings for people sometimes. You want to look and see which of these are showing up. If it's somebody's doing a reading about their home life, what this the emperor the emperor might represent is that maybe there's too much sternness, maybe there's too much follow the rules and rigidity. You might say that the emperor is the embodiment of conditional love, whereas the empress represents unconditional love. And that's classically the way it is for us. Most mothers love their children unconditionally and get that message across. And it's a very important message because it gives us a sense of, hope. It gives us a sense of it's going to be okay. Sometimes with the emperor or with our father figures, it can feel a lot like our fathers are too judgmental. But in a way, what they're doing is they're saying, I will love you if you accomplish this. They're creating a little bit of irritation or friction that causes a motivation to get somebody moving. And each are valuable in their own way. Unconditional love is good, but if we don't ever challenge our children, then it becomes enabling. The unconditional love becomes enabling. If, on the other hand, we don't have that unconditional love and we have too much challenging, then our family dynamic becomes hostile. It becomes frustrating because no matter how much we do, it's never good enough. That's the dark side or the downside of the emperor. Okay? Remember that the Empress very much is a card that embodies emotions, feelings, and as it relates to the physical body in the sense of the physical body sensation, it relates to our nature. Whereas the Emperor, he represents intellect, thought, government, or civilization. Now, a classic story that sort of illustrates the Emperor is I believe it's the story of King Solomon. You're probably all somewhat familiar with this. Two women came to the emperor's court, and they both claimed to be the mother of a baby. And they were arguing about who was the mother and who was not the mother. And this had been going on for quite a while. And they both presented their arguments to the king. And there was no clear evidence. There was no DNA at that time. So there was no real easy way to figure out who was the actual mother. So what King Solomon did was he drew his sword and he says, okay, listen, I don't think anybody can quite figure out which of you is the actual mother. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut the baby in half and you each get half of the baby. I can't think of any other way to resolve this. Well, one of them goes, okay, sure, that sounds all right. That sounds good. The other one says, no, give the baby to the first one. And at that moment, he knew who the real mother was. He knew that the mother would not let harm come to her child. And because of that, he gave the baby to the right mother. Now, you got to remember that for him to do that, he had to really pull that, for him to pull that off, he had to really sell it. It had to be real. It couldn't be fake. That's sort of that ruthless energy of the masculine sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes we have to have that warrior energy. Other times we have to have that unconditional love energy. So how are we doing? I'm going to stop talking for a second and see if anybody, I've been so busy looking at the cards, I didn't see if anybody sent me a message in chat. So let me look and see if anybody sent me a message. Or I'll just say, does anybody have a question they want to ask at this point? Okay, not hearing anything. So let me come back to my presentation. What's next? Okay. So the next card in the traditional tarot, if you look at a Rider-Waite, is the Hierophant. The Hierophant card is numbered number 5. Now, you know, I did a class a few years ago called Reading Cards You Hate. And one of the things that I did in that class is I asked people, which card do you dislike the most in the tarot? And what was very interesting is I thought I'd hear a lot of people say stuff like, oh, I hate the Tower card, or oh, okay, I just found my chat. I was having trouble finding the chat earlier. Some people, I thought people would say the Tower card, or they would say the Death card, or something like that. But interestingly enough, the Hierophant was the one that most people said they disliked. It's the card that they hated the most. And I thought, well, that was very interesting. And I think it has to do with the fact that many people have had negative experiences with religion. Now, does this mean that religion is necessarily a bad thing? No. What it means is, like anything, governments can be good or they can be bad. That should be very obvious. People in positions of authority can be good or they can be bad. Or people that run religions can be good or they can be bad. You know, it depends. Sometimes religion is something that people misuse. And Lina, I'm going to get to that question you had there in just a second. So the Hierophant, what does the word Hierophant mean? That's a really interesting question, because what the word means is the keeper of the sacred knowledge. Now the Hierophant, and what the figures in positions of authority within a religious order, what their job is to preserve or to protect sacred knowledge for those who want to learn. Mankind has a long history of doing some pretty stupid things when he's gone to war. There was a church in Belgium that was considered to be one of the great architectural achievements prior to the 19th century. And because the Germans got upset with the Belgians, they burned down the church. Instead of respecting the church. The French fired their cannons at the Sphinx for target practice, and that's how the Sphinx's nose got busted in Egypt. So, people can misuse their authority. But what the Hierophant is all about, he's about trying to preserve sacred knowledge. During the Dark Ages, there was a place in Ireland called Lindisfarne, and it was a special, like a monastery. It was hard to get to. It was definitely off the beaten path, and they were a place that kept a lot of ancient writings, so that they would be protected from those who would destroy it because of fanaticism. So the Hierophant does represent the keeper of the sacred knowledge. And you notice that here, the two people are sort of kneeling at his feet, and it's sort of a sense of a supplication. What that should represent is that if one wants to learn about spiritual information or spiritual knowledge, one needs to approach it with a certain amount of reverence or respect for the information that one achieves. But also, one of the things that's true about this card is that if you look at his right hand, you can see he's got 2 fingers up and 2 fingers down. Now, what that means is the Hierophant will convey certain knowledge, that's the fingers that are up, but he always is going to withhold a certain amount of information. So I'm going to come back to this card in a minute, but I want to look at some of the questions. Yvette says, he has all the tools and doesn't know it. So are you referring to the Fool or to the Magician? That, let me see, maybe I need to unmute you here, see if I can do that. Actually, I'm going to come out of the screen, the sharing for a minute, so I can unmute you.
I did it.
Okay, you did it. Okay, good. So what did you mean?
Well, I meant that the magician has all his tools in front of him
Yep.
and he doesn't know it yet. I mean, he's got it right there and he's starting to go forward. If he went from the fool to the magician, he's got, you know, he's got the cups, he's got the wands, he's got everything he needs to go forward with his journey.
Okay, actually, if you think of what the magician is, he is expressing. He is manifesting any and all of the suits. So not only does he have the tools, he's bringing the tools forth. The magician is confirmation for the fool that it is possible to acquire the knowledge.
Okay.
So he is aware of it. The fool does not know those tools. Now, Lorraine asked me, is this being recorded? Yes, it is. So you will be able to review it. I'll send you out instructions on how to do that. And Lina asked me, if the card is reversed, does it mean the opposite of these interpretations? That's a very good question. I want to say yes and no. Let me see if I can be more vague. No, more clear. Here's the thing. Reverse cards are, I think, probably one of the biggest challenges in the tarot. People get really freaked out about reverse cards because they think, well, you know, it's hard enough learning 78 cards. Now I have to learn 156. So the way you want to look at reverse cards is really pretty simple. Learn what the card means upright. And then, just like you say, does it mean the opposite? Very often, yes, the card will mean exactly the opposite if it's reversed, but not always. Sometimes what a reverse card is indicating is that something is in development with a client. They're working on. So let's say they had a magician reversed, and this is, you know, there's no clear-cut way to know this. You have to look at the cards surrounding it. You have to listen to your intuition. But sometimes when you look at it and you look around it and you see what the other cards are saying, what it might be saying is the person is in the process of actualizing their magician. It's not that they don't have any power, it's that they're learning how to express their power. They haven't mastered it yet. Now, what might indicate that would be if there were pages, because pages are students. In fact, I think the fool and the pages are all of a similar ilk, cut from the same cloth. So if there was a magician card reversed and there were some pages around it, that might very well be an indication that, you know, it's in development, it's in process. So there are many different ways you can work with a reverse card, but I think the way to start is learn it upright and then think, just like you said, what would the opposite of this be? Or what would let's say, if it's not, okay, like let's take the Hierophant, which we were just talking about a minute ago. If the Hierophant represents religious wisdom, going to like a sacred teachings and learning from them, it's getting knowledge through study. So the opposite of that might be, instead of finding somebody else to teach you, you have to accept responsibility for your own acquisition of knowledge. So I think of that as sort of the Hierophant reverse. I'd like to say it this way: you are responsible for your own salvation. You're responsible to find your own way. Okay? Any other, okay, let's see. Any other questions here? It doesn't look like it. Okay, I'm gonna go back to the PowerPoint then, all right? We're just gonna go a little bit longer and then we're gonna be done for the night. Let's see here. Share screen, desktop 2. Okay, you can see the Hierophant again, right? Okay, thank you, Chris. A shaking head is about the best I can hope for right now. Okay, so now this is, I'm going to tell you something about this class. I'm going to teach you all of the classic cards the Rider-Waite cards, but I'm also going to point out to you why my deck is different. Because I think when you look at the numerology, some cards just don't make sense. Everything we've talked about so far, the Fool, the Magician, the High Priestess, the Emperor, and the Empress, all of those corresponded perfectly with the numerological meaning of the numbers. But you get to number 5, and the numerological keywords for 5 are this: innovation, inspiration, versatility, flexibility, resourcefulness, constructive freedom, change, curiosity, progress, courage, movement, pioneering, expanding horizons, travel, impulsive, revolutionary, rebellion, and restlessness. Now, you look at most of those words, they really don't fit very well with this card. You could say inspiration fits, because a good Hierophant or a good priest is going to be somewhat inspirational. But religion does not look very favorably upon innovation. They also are not big fans of flexibility in terms of interpreting their moral code. They're not in favor of change. They're very much in favor of preserving things as it has been for a long time. So they're very much not about movement or pioneering or expanding one's horizons. So here it just doesn't work. Doesn't mean this card does not have value, but it may actually fit better somewhere else. And we're going to see what that is. But for right now, I want to show you something. Take those same numerological keywords and apply them to this card. And it works perfectly. The Chariot, I think, works really well as a 5, as opposed to the Hierophant. The Chariot's very much about progress. It's about pioneering. You can think of this guy as riding his chariot out. Behind him is civilization, represented by the buildings, and he's in his chariot, and he's going out into the world with a certain amount of inspiration. He's inspired to bring about change. He's curious about his world. So in a way, the Chariot is very reminiscent of the Fool, but here now he is starting to grapple with his world. I think of the Chariot as the charioteer as a warrior. I definitely think of him as someone who does battle, but he's not a mercenary. He's not a soldier. He's not someone who fights blindly. A real, true warrior is someone who fights for justice, who fights for freedom, who fights for ideals. The Chariot represents a certain amount of idealism. And I like to say it this way, that this guy actually will serve the emperor, the ruler of civilization, and that's why I think he fits to have him follow the emperor, because he serves as long as the emperor is just. So there's a little bit of a check and balance thing going on here. If the emperor becomes too rigid, if it becomes too inflexible, then the Chariot will challenge the existing order. So he represents that movement within society that will not tolerate tyranny. It won't tolerate tyranny. So I think this card works much better as a 5 than as the Hierophant does. He's very much about restlessness. He's not going to accept things as they are. He will serve the emperor. He'll try to expand the kingdom by taking things out and discovering what's going on in the world by exploring the world. Now, the vessel here, the Chariot itself, I think is symbolic of our physical self. We ride through life with our physical vessel, going out and looking for and trying to figure out what is going on in life by moving through life. And you see on his chariot, there's this thing. If you look at the Rider-Waite, there's this little red thing, looks like a circle with a post through it. I have the same thing on my shield. Mine's turned sideways slightly. And then above that, on my card, you see the yin-yang symbol again. And on the Rider-Waite, you just see the circle of wholeness. Well, it's like the circle of wholeness has taken flight. The Yoni, which is what the red thing is, represents the union of the male and the female. So here, the Chariot is picked up on the union of the energies of the magician and the high priestess, but also the emperor and the empress. He's got that creativity of joining the masculine and the feminine, and now he's putting that creativity into work in terms of expanding his world. So that's what he's all about. Some other symbols on this card that are important. If you look closely at his kilt, I guess you could call it, there's some little symbols on there that look a little bit like astrology, but they're actually alchemy symbols. Now, what alchemy is, most people have heard of it, but I want to tell you a little bit more about what it is. Alchemy is the process of converting lead into gold. Now, we've all heard that, but what does it really mean? Well, it's not literal lead into gold. It's taking the lead of dense misperception of reality and converting it into the gold of proper understanding. That's what the alchemy is about. How do you do that? You do that by interacting with the world. That's what the charioteer is about. Now, he has a belt, and on the belt, that's where you find the actual astrological symbols. There's a moon, there's Cancer, there's Leo. Those are the ones you can make out anyway. And the idea is that as we interact with the world and we interact with astrological people or astrological energy, what happens is we learn a lot about ourselves, we learn a lot about human behavior, and we expand our sense of our world. Astrology is a great tool for expanding our sense of awareness in the world. Okay, so I'm going to stop this share because we are about almost done with our time tonight, but I want to give everybody a chance to, let me unmute everybody and see if anybody has any questions.
How would you, so like when the Hierophant gets pulled in a reading, what's the overall, it's like, yes, he's like the keeper of knowledge and all that, but like, what does it usually mean?
In a reading?
Yeah, like what's your first instinct if like just that one comes out? I don't know. Does that?
Well, the way I look at it is that sometimes it's really necessary to look up sacred knowledge, to look at and to take into consideration what do the ancients say about it. My teacher used to say, you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And what he meant by that was that you may get to a place where you recognize that a religion is outdated. It's lost its value. In fact, I'll just say this to you directly. When I was a young man, I really struggled with the religion that I was raised in. And at a certain point, I left the church that I belonged to. And I had a lot of anger towards that church and towards what they taught. And that was me throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
So later on, my teacher sort of taught me that there was wisdom in all the ancient spiritual teachings. But like anything, you have to be willing to separate the wheat from the chaff. You have to be willing to, some teachings are going to be universal. They're going to be eternal because they're based upon an eternal truth. And like, for instance, that's that story about Solomon. There's still wisdom in that story. Or the story of Joseph from the Bible. There's a lot more to that story than just some guy gets sold into slavery by his brothers. But you have to learn to how to work with the archetypes. You have to learn how to work with the stories and work, figure out what the knowledge is. So when the card comes up in a reading, it might be a call for a person to re-examine his beliefs or his attitudes towards religion. It might also be something as simple as there's a person in a position of authority, because very often the Hierophant represents secular authority or a religious authority, whereas the emperor is secular authority. But there's a quality of sometimes people rule a company almost from a charismatic sort of religious fanatical leader point of view, and so the Hierophant can be representative of some kind of knowledge, or no, some kind of a person in a position of authority that has to be dealt with. So the
Okay.
person has to figure out how to deal with that person in a position of authority. Who else?
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.